anytime we hear words, see images, see body language, communication is taking place. We use it so often that we probably at some point take it for granted. And yet, we're still pretty bad at it sometimes.
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Okay, so today we're talking about communication. And really the idea for this podcast came from a parent kind of, halfway in jest, talking about the fact that young people seem to be struggling to talk to one another today. And, we're supposed to be, hopefully equipping our young people to have good relationships, to be servants, to be respectful and considerate of others. But I think, and hopefully it's not just us being crotchety older people, but we can see that younger people, they're communicating differently with electronic devices. But are we going to, in our culture, ever really going to be able to get away from some of the face-to-face interactions that are necessary in different aspects of our lives? And so I got to thinking that, this would be worth talking about probably from the standpoint of young people, friendships, relationships, dating, that sort of thing. But there's also, just a lot of relationships that Christians are involved in, and we need to be communicating a certain way. And so let's talk start by talking about young people dating and communicating and some of the pitfalls of that. I think, Lonnie, you had maybe a study that you were going to mention.
Yeah, I was listening to an audiobook the other day, and it was just talking about some of the challenges that this new generation is facing with communication, particularly with face-to-face interactions, because the primary means of communicating that they've been accustomed to is electronic texting and things of that nature. And it's become a challenge, particularly like in dating, because they've not had the experience of these face-to-face interactions. And it was interesting because it was talking about the training that we receive as we deal with people and communicating is training that they're lacking. And they're not picking up on different social cues. They're not picking up on maybe facial expressions and things of that nature. So it's creating a challenge on that. But maybe we need to start by just thinking about what the Bible has to say about communication in general. What are some general principles that God gives us about our communication with each other? What do y'all think?
Well, one thing that the Bible teaches is that we always want to speak truth. I think about passages like Ephesians 4 that tell us that speaking the truth in love, and that we need to lay aside lying in verse 29, that and that we speak truth because we're members one of another. So especially when we're talking about our relationships together with those who are in Christ, whether that's in a local church or in a dating relationship or a marriage, we certainly want to speak truth because that's the only thing that is really going to be helpful to people. Now, we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings unnecessarily. We don't want to just be mean or mean-spirited even. But when we're telling people the truth, ideally what we're doing is we're telling them what they need to know about where we are in a relationship, or we're telling them the truth about, there's always, maybe in a local congregation, I think we're going to talk kind of broadly about all of this, but sometimes there are going to be hard truths that have to be communicated. And Tad made mention before the show that sometimes our failure to say hard truths is not because we're worried about hurting people's feelings. We just lack courage. And so when I think about telling the truth, even in difficult situations, the example that comes to mind is Nathan and David, where Nathan comes and he wants to say it in the kindest way. He wants to frame it in the best way. You can tell with Nathan that he doesn't come and just say, well, I'm going to tell him the truth. I don't care how he reacts. No, he wants David to react in the very best way. But that shapes how he approaches David. So he tells the parable of the man who had the sheep. And then right when David is compelled by this story, he says, you're the man. You're the one who's done this. So he doesn't back away, but he also doesn't just come in with guns blazing and just say, you've sinned, and he frames it in a way that I think is the most helpful. So we want to speak the truth, but that doesn't mean we don't have to speak the truth in love. It means we can say it in a way that we won't stand in the way. Our attitude won't stand in the way of the person receiving it. They may not listen, but don't let it be on us.
Yeah, and that just goes for the maybe truth about our feelings as well. That kind of plays into different relationships. Maybe we feel a certain way, and the way that we feel, we are perceiving as reality right now. We need to talk about that. We need to go ahead and get what we're saying, how we feel out there, and maybe we can respectfully go back and forth and talk about, well, maybe, here's how some things really are, and this is how I meant it, and kind of going through that process can help us, move toward being on the same page. And at times that can be really tense. I mean, I think of Acts chapter 15 when Paul and Barnabas are confronting these Judaizing teachers. There was a time that it was really tense, and probably part of it was because those guys wouldn't back down from the error that they were promoting. But when you've got two people who are wanting to get on the same page, well, it may be a little bit messy as you go through that, but you've got to go through that process because what's going to end up happening is going to be so worth it. You're going to be together. That tension's going to be behind you, and probably that process is going to bring you closer together.
Yeah, so thinking about what both of y'all are saying on this, when we're communicating with someone, what we're trying to figure out is, I want to know where you're at. I want to know what you believe or what you're thinking about this. And I know there may be exceptions to that where we don't want to know because of maybe it'll hurt our feelings or something. But generally speaking, we want to know where a person's at. There's nothing worse than wondering, I don't really know if they're, I'm not reading them and I don't know what they're thinking about that. So I think that at the very core, communication is about expressing what's really going on with us. So truth is essential to that, to know where we're at. And yet our society is not good about telling the truth on things. We hedge it in so many different ways. Talking about speaking the truth in love, another principle that I see there that I think would be applicable in communication is when Jesus talks about do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And putting ourselves in that position and saying, how can I express what's really going on with me and share this in a way, but do it in a way that is in love, that is with kindness, that's with tact, in such a way that expresses and conveys the truth of where I'm at, but does it in such a way from that person's perception that it's as palatable as possible.
Yeah, and I think maybe we need courage to receive an undesired response. Maybe that's what keeps us back. So it's young people maybe thinking about getting to know one another and dating, and I'm afraid that this person's going to tell me that they don't like me. Well, I mean, isn't that better than not knowing and just going on floating around and nobody knows what's going on? I feel like some certainty would give us the chance to, okay, I know where I stand. I'm going to have to pursue something else, someone else. And maybe in other relationships, in marriage or in, at work or among churches, we're afraid that someone is going to tell us maybe that there's something maybe that we need to change or that we've done that they would like us to confront. And that's what's going to be necessary for the relationship to grow and move forward.
Yeah, so taking the dating situation, you've got a young man and a young woman, and they're dating, and one is afraid to tell the other that the relationship's not going in a direction that they're comfortable with. And so they continue to let this go on and play it. Well, is that better? Or is that a better situation? And I think most of us who've gone through the dating process would say, no, that's terrible. Sure, what it does is it prolongs the suffering rather than getting it out there. See, I don't think you'd have to come up and say, all right, look, I don't like you, we're done. But you need to let that person honestly know that, I'm not sure that I'm as serious about this as I once was, or maybe we need to go in a different direction here. And let that person know where you're standing at that, and do it in such a way that there's kindness and there's love in that, thinking about, well, how would I want to be told this?
So here's a question for you guys. Just thinking about communication in general, and of course we can make specific applications to dating, or we've already mentioned in our marriage, or just at work, or at school, or any relationship, even in the church, fellow church members or the eldership and the congregation. All of these demand some level of communication. So what's really the downside if we refuse to communicate or we don't communicate well? What are the problems that come if we never learn to communicate the right way?
I think Tad mentioned in the pre-show Jesus' statement about if your brother sins against you. And he doesn't give us an option on that of just let it go, don't say anything about it. He says, go to your brother. And what's at stake there is losing that relationship or gaining your brother. And so when you're talking about what's at stake with talking to someone, communicating well with someone, if there's a problem in the relationship, Jesus' instruction is go and communicate that problem in hopes of resolving it and gaining that relationship back to what it's supposed to be. So that's one example.
Yeah. And I think about when we disagree maybe on some kind of doctrinal issue within a congregation, or maybe as a husband and wife we have some disagreement. The easy thing is to just not talk about it, right? The easy thing is to just let everything fall apart. That happens in marriages. It happens in local congregations where instead of doing the hard thing of communicating and talking and working to a resolution, we just go our separate ways. So it happens with local churches, and it happens in marriages, unfortunately. So I think one of the benefits of developing the ability to communicate effectively is that when we do have even really serious disagreements, we can work through those together. And if we haven't developed that when maybe things aren't as tense, if we haven't developed that when maybe things are a little easier, then when times are hard, that's not going to be when we're able to develop those communication skills. And I think we've all seen that. And I'm thinking primarily about local churches where we just have maybe two elements within a group, and they just have different opinions on this, and maybe it's boiling under the surface and everybody knows that, but nobody's willing to cross that boundary and say, hey, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's look at the scriptures and communicate about this, it requires courage. It requires telling the truth about what we're seeing in this. And it also demands, as Tad may mentioned just a second ago, the courage to be confronted with this truth, and a willingness and a humility to change and to be molded by that. And without all of those things, not only is communication impossible, but even when we start talking, it wouldn't be very, very valuable.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that our culture and society is very much out of step with God's rules for communication, and that makes it even more of a challenge for Christians, because I don't think the world is used to communicating with truthfulness. I don't think the world is used to communicating with the end result of, we want to resolve this, we want it to be better when it's over with. I think the world is much more comfortable with telling something that it will placate the situation at the moment and allow it to continue to fester, and that's not the way that God says to deal with it. So that creates a challenge. If we're going to follow God's instruction, we will be going against the culture in communication as well.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes divisions will have to occur within local churches because of the very nature of truth, right? There are some times where we can't just keep going on together if this is going to be the way one group is going to act or the other group is going to act. But so many times we hear of local congregations that divide because of issues of communication, right? Some kind of personal preference, and then it became a he said, she said, he said kind of thing. And that's such a shame, because those are the very things that could be addressed, and even those doctrinal questions, the things that are very, very serious and maybe even would be a reason for dividing. If we had had effective communication all along, maybe we could have prevented that too.
Yeah, Tad mentioned in our pre-show discussion that instance in Acts chapter 6 where Grecian widows were being overlooked in their serving of food there, and really that's the first recorded problem inside the church. The church had faced some problems from the outside, but that's the first one that we read about, that church in Jerusalem, an inside problem. And it may have been difficult to communicate about some of those things. However, the problem was communicated, and the problem was seemingly resolved, and everything went on. And in our world today, you can conceive of this problem happening and people just refusing to communicate about it, and then just deciding, well, we'll just go somewhere else and we'll start our own church and we'll do our own thing. And you don't ever have to reconcile. You don't have to worry about sorting out issues. You just go and so that's a case where communication within the church was very effective, and you can see where sometimes when that's not the case, tragic things happen.
Yeah. Tad mentioned Acts 15 earlier, referred to Acts 15 earlier, where here's a different understanding on a doctrinal issue, and yet good communication through that, And the end result was everybody was on the same page. And again, I think people look at that and go, wow, that's amazing. That church didn't split over that. Well, that's because they love truth, and they seem to treat each other respectfully, even though there was great dissension over this in the beginning.
Yeah, so no matter what the relationship is, it seems like the same basic principles are at play, that we would have truth. We would speak honestly about what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and there would be a submission to a standard of truth, particularly for Christians if we're talking about, religious relationships that have been generated because we're Christians. But still just the truth and the honesty in dealing with one another in maybe less theological ways. There's all kind of things that come up in relationships and marriages. Love your neighbor as yourself, probably a good principle to apply. Well, how would I want to be approached in this situation? Having the courage to accept possible changes that I may need to make. I could just see in Acts 6 that when you figure out who's been neglected, that it's all one group. That'd be pretty humiliating. Like we have overlooked these people because of this. That would be strong evidence that one group's being overlooked, the Grecian widows. We've overlooked these people because they're different than us. We just weren't thinking about them as intentionally as we need to be. So that could be pretty humiliating. When I think, Larson, you quoted Romans 12 verse 5, we're members of one another in churches. Larson, you said that there may come a time when we have to divide. There may come a time. I think that's true. I think Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 11. Mm-hmm. There may come that time, but so many times, if we would bring these things into our communication process, love, submission to truth, courage to hear changes that I need to make, my guess is that we could probably work through some of those things, and what would happen is that it would mean we have built trust for one another, and the Lord is going to be glorified through what's happened.
Yeah, Jared, you asked the question about what are some of the benefits of good communication. I think that in part, the benefits of good communication are the reason why God put us in all of these various relationships in the first place. So why is it not good for a man to be alone? Why is it not good for a Christian to be out in isolation? I think one problem that we all recognize about ourselves is that we struggle very deeply with self-reflection. It's always hard for us to see flaws in ourselves. And so God has put us in what should be healthy, meaningful relationships to help us see the flaws and the problems that we have. And when we have people who we trust, and who we know care about us, and they tell us, here's something we need to work on, whether that's the elders or whether it's our spouse, then we need to be willing to not only accept it, but even embrace it as one of the positives of the relationship, not one of the negative side effects of, always getting on my case and telling me what I need to be doing right. Well, maybe there's a situation in which that's the case. But what I'm saying is that's part of being in a relationship is we get this benefit of somebody else to kind of reflect for us when we sometimes struggle to see the issues that we have.
Maybe we need to talk about that before marriage more often than we do.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Hey, part of what this is going to mean is that they're going to be able to expose a lot of things that you don't know about yourself. And
we talked last week about wanting to marry somebody who's going to help you get to heaven. Well, how are they going to help you if they don't offer some loving correction from time to time? That's part of what it means to, you can't help somebody get to heaven by just saying, yeah, everything you're doing is just fine. Don't change anything. And sometimes we say, well, that's the downside of marriage. Well, no, it's not. It's the great benefit of marriage is that we have somebody who we know cares about us and that we trust, who's telling us what we need to know most.
It's a downside if you don't know why you should appreciate that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I think we've talked about everything that we intended to talk about, and I think it actually turned out okay. We had we were a little hesitant at the beginning, didn't know how it was going to go, but I think it went well, and hopefully this is going to be helpful to you. We appreciate you continuing to listen to us, and just hope that you'll keep tuning in. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.
Anytime we see words, hear words, or say words, communication is taking place. What are you doing, man? Don't look at me. Look at Lonnie.
Hide
Look
behind,
at-
you, hide behind your computer screen again.
No, I'm not looking at Hovager over there.
What happened, man?
Hovager.
Anytime we see words, hear words, read words,
You
podcast words.
You know all your
Read
senses are
words.
working.
What's wrong?
I
with
thought
that?
it was okay, man. It was
It
okay.
was not bad. We just make fun of anything.
Anytime we hear words, say words, or read words, communication is taking place. We take it for granted. Will you stop?
I don't think y'all need me.
We need you. I'll say something else. I don't know why that's so.
No, it's not.
I'll say
even,
something
I
else.
wasn't even listening to you anymore. Just
Wow. An episode of communication. Last thing Jared says before we start is, I'm not even listening to you anymore.
That's the problem.
We are a great model for
We've
this.
identified the problem.
We're not going to
Does
get it
go to
done
the
before
bathroom
Lonnie gets
during
to
the
leave.
intro.
No.
We need it. We need this podcast more than we thought we did.
Yeah.